In Part 3 of the U.S. History Review for Georgia High School graduation test, we will talk about the Civil War through Reconstruction. Let's begin with the causes of the Civil War. First, the abolitionism movement. This was the belief that African Americans should be freed immediately. Two major leaders in the abolition movement were William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Now, this movement was very weak throughout the country until Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. After Uncle Tom's Cabin, many Northerners sided with the abolitionists. Our next important cause, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. With this compromise, Missouri requested to enter the Union as a slave state. However, if Missouri were to enter as a slave state, then that would throw off the balance between free and slave states in Congress. So the compromise says that Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and this compromise drew a line at the 36-degree parallel and said that slavery would be allowed south of the line in the future and not allowed north of it. The importance of this compromise was to try to maintain the slave versus free state balance in Congress. The nullification crisis was between Vice President John C. Calhoun, who was an advocate for states' rights, versus President Andrew Jackson, who stood for the control and authority of the federal government. The nullification crisis was based on the idea that many slave state politicians began to argue that states should and could overrule federal laws within their own state. South Carolina was the leader in this movement, and they were against a protective tariff that hurt the South and benefited the North. This is important because it showed early indications of a growing division between the North and the South. The next cause, the Mexican-American War, was fought between U.S. and Mexico over Texas and other territory to the west. This is going to be a great reflection of manifest destiny, and ultimately the U.S. will win under the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo. This treaty gave the U.S. Texas and most of the rest of the West. At the end of the war, gold was discovered in California, and this led to a rapid expansion of our population to the west. The problem is, this made the slavery issue worse. David Wilmot believed he had the solution for this issue of slavery. In the Wilmot Proviso, he proposed to Congress that Congress should declare slavery would be illegal in all territory gained from the war with Mexico. Unfortunately, this caused too much of a debate in Congress, and it failed to pass. Our next important cause and next compromise, the Compromise of 1850. This attempted to settle the debate over new territories gained from Mexico. And again, the question is, should these territories, when they enter as states, be slave or free? There are four important provisions that come out of the Compromise of 1850 that you need to remember. First, California was admitted as a free state, but it set up popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery in other territories. Now, popular sovereignty was the idea that the people should choose whether or not their state would be slave or free. This compromise also abolished the slave trade, not slavery itself, but trade. It also passed the fugitive slave law in an attempt to appease the South. As mentioned in the previous slide, the Compromise of 1850 established popular sovereignty. The next cause, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is going to allow residents of new states to decide whether or not to allow slavery. So this is the actual carrying out of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also did away with the line created by the Missouri Compromise. Unfortunately, popular sovereignty failed because pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into the territory and established two governments. Violence eventually erupted, and this represents the failure of popular sovereignty. Dred Scott versus Sanford was a very important Supreme Court case that came out of the pre-Civil War era. Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom, and he said that because he had lived in a free state for several years, he should be free. The Supreme Court ruled against him, however, and said that slaves were not citizens and therefore could not sue in court. The Supreme Court also said that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the states. The final cause of the Civil War that we're going to talk about today is John Brown's raid. John Brown was a white abolitionist who wanted to arm slaves to enable them to escape. He led an assault on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. Now, even though his assault was put down, it did lead to a growing issue between the North and the South. The North will view him as a hero, and the South will be afraid of other assaults similar to John Brown's. With the election of Abraham Lincoln and the fall of Fort Sumter, the Civil War was set into motion. Now, both sides, the Union, or North, and the Confederacy, the South, had very strong leaders. For the Union, the president was Abraham Lincoln, military generals Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. Now, keep in mind, William T. Sherman will become famous for his burning of Atlanta and his march to the sea. Confederate leaders, Jefferson Davis is the president, and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson will make up important military leaders. Two important turning points that you need to keep in mind. First, Gettysburg. Gettysburg was July 3, 1863, and it was a Union victory. Later, Abraham Lincoln will visit the battlefield and will commemorate the battlefield with the Gettysburg Address. Vicksburg, July 4, 1863, was a very important Union victory because the Union gained control of the Mississippi River and effectively cut the South in half. Another major event of the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation said that January 1st of 1863, slaves would be freed in areas still in rebellion. This transformed the war from being not just about preserving the Union, but also about freedom. Now remember, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in areas in rebellion, not all slaves. It's not going to be until the 13th Amendment that slavery is abolished throughout the nation. The Union had many advantages that helped it to win the Civil War. First, a larger population. Second, industrial weapons and production. And then finally, transportation of the movement and supplies. The time period after the Civil War was known as Reconstruction, and this is when our nation was trying to figure out how to rebuild our country, how to rebuild the South. There were two plans: presidential Reconstruction, which was first introduced by Abraham Lincoln, and then after his assassination will be supported by Andrew Johnson. Presidential Reconstruction wanted rapid readmission of the South without punishment. So in other words, they were granting amnesty or forgiveness of the South. Now, Congress was led by the radical Republicans. They disagreed. They wanted to punish the South and had stricter demands for how the South should re-enter the Union. The dispute between the two, President and Congress, over how we should conduct Reconstruction will ultimately lead the House to impeach Johnson. Now, the Senate fell one vote short of actually removing him from office. During Reconstruction, the national government established the Freedmen's Bureau. This was established to help assist freed slaves. It helped them find work and adjust to economic freedom, and set up over 4,000 schools, including Morehouse College. Also during Reconstruction, we will have the Civil War amendments added to the Constitution. These amendments, the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery, the 14th made freed slaves citizens and guaranteed equal protection of the law or due process, and finally the 15th Amendment allowed the right for black males to vote. Unfortunately, there was a lot of resistance and backlash to Reconstruction. The two best examples of this, black codes, were a series of laws passed in the South to prevent these freed slaves from having equal rights, and the KKK, which will symbolize most vividly the white backlash of the Reconstruction era. All right, guys, this ends our Social Studies Georgia High School graduation test review. Don't forget, Monday, March 18th, A Hall. Be there or be square.